On July 14th of 2020, I was on a family vacation with some friends, and I was up early, and I sat down on the screen porch of the place we were renting, and I wrote out a plan for the next 5 years of my life. I'd never done something like this before. It's never something that had really entered my mind. I'd always heard people talk about 5-year plans, but for me, this was the first time I had made a long-term plan for my life. And now we're here 4 years later. I recently completed the 4-year review of that plan, which I do every year. And I got to tell you, it's been amazing to see the Lord's providence and connecting the dots from where I had planned to be in 5 years to where I am now 4 years into that 5-year plan. It's been really helpful for me. And what I want to do today is talk to you about this idea of how do you create a 5-year plan? Is this something we're supposed to be doing as Christians? Is it something that's useful for us, planning that far ahead? And I'm going to walk you through sort of like a biblical basis for 5-year planning. That's kind of the order of the show today. I want to talk about first, how can we develop maybe a biblical basis for long-term planning. Every time I talk about this idea of planning, whether it's about goal setting or other levels of planning for your life, I often get pushback from believers who somewhere along the line have gotten it in their heads that you can't be planning ahead. You shouldn't be planning ahead because the Lord's sovereign. Maybe they have a fatalistic notion of that, or they have some idea, like Keswick idea of let go and let God, and I should just wait until the motivation strikes. I don't know where it comes from, but it constantly comes up. And so we're going to talk about this biblical basis for long-term planning. Then I want to share the methodology I've used for planning these last 5 years, as thus 4 years of my 5-year plan, kind of give you some ideas about how you could do something similar. And then finally, what I want to do is share the benefits I've seen myself. I want to talk to you about just kind of personally how this plan is fleshed out for me. And honestly, like I have been blown away by the results of it. Like it's incredible when I show you the plan and kind of where I was and where I am now. Nothing but the grace of God could have made these things add up. But moreover, the big point I want to make today is it helps to write down your plans, and that enables you to spring into action and actually work towards making those things happen instead of being more in reactive mode, which I think a lot of us live in. So let's dive into that. Let's look at a biblical basis for long-term planning. Is there a biblical basis for long-term planning? Should we be planning long-term like this? Or is this something that's a product of our own vanity, our own conceit, that I'm going to make these big plans? And of course, I've talked about this lots of other places. You can go look back at other episodes, especially ones on goal setting. I addressed this in a video last year, really in depth, I think. But just a couple points I want to make today on this idea of long-term planning. And the first one is that in the scriptures, you see that diligence tends to lead to abundance. Diligence tends to lead to abundance. It is blessed by God when people are diligent. We're commanded to be diligent, and we often see that leads to good things for us. We see this in Proverbs 21:5. The plans of the diligent lead surely to abundance, but everyone who is hasty comes only to poverty, right? So there's this contrast. Diligence is contrasted with hastiness, right? It's a short-term view versus a long-term view. That's kind of the big picture here. And that's where I draw out this idea that, hey, long-term planning is not a bad thing. It's part and parcel of diligence. Maybe at your stage in life, you're listening to a podcast about productivity, or you're watching this on YouTube and you're thinking, yeah, I'm pretty productive in my day-to-day life. But you don't expand your time horizon very much. If you live that way, you're kind of like, I'm just trying to get through this week or through this day. The trouble is you end up in sort of these hasty schemes, right? Like people who fall for example, for a get-rich-quick scheme, they are people who are thinking short-term, whereas people who invest, they're slow, they're methodical, they have the long-term view. And so the same, I think, is true when we're pursuing a life of faithfulness, where we're saying, hey, I want to live a fruitful life of faithfulness before God, and so I'm not going to do that hastily. I'm going to be slow about it. I'm going to trust that doing the right things today is going to pay off in the long term. And part of that, I think, is imagining and trusting that if I have this long-term view of where I would like my life to go, where I would like my faithfulness to be in these different areas of life, that I can work towards that. And so I think longitudinal planning, so we'll call it like a 5-year plan like this, it's a subset of that way of thinking. We're breaking our lives down into 10-year or 5-year chunks, and we're kind of saying, what would faithfulness look like in 5 years in these various areas, right? So you're not saying that you have full control over this. We'll get into this a little bit more, but you're saying, in 5 years, what would faithfulness look like with my finances? What would I hope to see there? In 5 years, what would faithfulness look like in my relationships? Where would I like to be? In 5 years, what would faithfulness look like with my health or with my fitness? And we'll go through each of those when I talk about the methodology in just a minute. But that's the big picture, is by doing this long-term planning, we're thinking, what does faithfulness look like in each of these areas? And I think you see this in the parable of the stewards. Matthew 25, verse 16 says, he who had received the 5 talents went at once and traded with them, and he made 5 talents more. Right? So this is the parable of the talents, these 3 different servants of this master. Before he goes away, they're entrusted with varying amounts of money. I read a whole book on this. It's called Well Done, A Strategy for Life Stewardship. And one of the things I drew out as I studied the parable was, wow, the difference between these faithful stewards, the ones who invested what the Lord, who the master represents in the parable, what he entrusted to them, well, the difference between them who did it well and the one who squandered it was that these diligent ones, or these faithful ones, were marked by diligence. They did the hard work of planning ahead. Like I just showed in that verse, right? It says that he went at once and traded with them, and he made 5 talents more. It's implied that he is strategic about it. He's making a plan. He's saying, okay, I'm going to invest it here. I'm going to invest it here. Why? Because his objective is to make a good return. And you don't make a good return by being hasty. You do it by planning well. If I'm going to live a faithful life, it's going to require some degree of planning. Yes, there is the day-to-day. Am I walking close with the Lord? Am I abiding in the vine? Absolutely. That is critical, and that I would say is foundational. But there's also, faithfulness requires us to have some sort of long-term view of how are all these stacking? How are these things working together? What is it that I'm striving for in the long term? So the first point we saw there is biblical basis for long-term planning is that diligence tends to lead to abundance. So that's why we should do long-term plan. That's why we should look even 5 or 10 years in the future and saying, where do I hope to be at those points? Second thing I would say there is that long-term planning is the opposite of laziness. So this is another point in favor of this idea of long-term planning that I think we see in the scriptures, is that laziness is often contrasted with those who planned ahead. And so I think we have warrant to do this because we see that contrast throughout the scriptures. Just a couple verses here is Proverbs 12:24. If you're watching this on YouTube, by the way, all these verses I'm putting up on the screen. So if you're listening to this on the podcast, that's great. But if you want to follow along, I have a couple different slides I'm throwing up there with the verses. So if you hear me referencing stuff, that's what I'm doing. So the hand of the diligent will rule, while the slothful will be put to forced labor. So again, there is a contrast between diligence and laziness, right? So we saw the contrast between diligence and hastiness. There's also a contrast between diligence and laziness. It's pressed even further in Proverbs 13:4. It says, the soul of the sluggard craves and gets nothing, while the soul of the diligent is richly supplied. And so here again, the laziness, the sluggard, is contrasted with the diligent. And so that's kind of just the big point I'm trying to make here. Laziness is the opposite of diligence. So long-term planning is the opposite of laziness. I think you see this really clearly in Proverbs 6:9-11. It says, how long will you lie there, O sluggard? When will you arise from your sleep? A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest, and poverty will come upon you like a robber, and want like an armed man. Right? So here's the sluggard, the lazy person. This person is being criticized by Solomon. He's being criticized by God as somebody who is just going to lay there. They're not going to do things. But what should they have been doing? The point here is that the sloth's problem was that he refused to plan ahead. The sloth's problem is that he's lazy, yeah, but laziness is a refusal to plan. And so what ends up happening, poverty comes upon him. He doesn't take care of the things that need to be taken care of because he's just living for today. And the third biblical point I want to make here about the basis for long-term planning is that there are biblical examples of long-term planning. There are biblical examples of these characters in the scriptures that are sort of spelled out for us and held up to us as examples of people whose diligence is marked by a foresight, a planning with the future in mind. It's not a negative thing, it's a positive thing. We see this, of course, with Joseph, right? Joseph exemplified long-term planning through his guidance to Pharaoh, right? He advised Pharaoh of storing up a surplus of grain during the 7 years of abundance so that he could prepare for the subsequent 7 years of famine. Remember, this is revealed to Joseph in a dream. And so his advice to Pharaoh is, let's store up for those years of famine that are coming ahead. And that strategy not only saved Egypt, but it ensured the survival of his own family, of the people of God, right? You know the story. If you're watching, you can pause it here if you want to read the passage, but it's just Genesis 41, 25 through 40. It gives a little bit more context for this. But it's not just Joseph. We also have another great example in the Apostle Paul. And again, this is one I've gone into in depth in a lot of different places. But Paul is held up to us an example of someone who does long-term planning. And I think some people might be surprised by this because sometimes when people think about the life of Paul, they think he's kind of like an adventurer, right? He's a missionary. He goes here and then he goes here. Wherever the Spirit guides him, he's just going to go and do the next thing. And we kind of romanticize the Christian life and say, that's how I should be living too, is just sort of like skin in my teeth. Who knows what today holds? I'm just open to whatever the Lord has for me. And I would just say there that heart posture, that's right. I want to be open to whatever the Lord has for me. But if you actually look at the example of Paul's life, he was open to what the Lord had for him because sometimes the Lord redirected him, but he also did plan ahead. We read in Romans 15, 23 through 32 that Paul planned, he intended to visit Rome en route to Spain. All right, and if you're watching again, you can pause and read the passage if you want. I have it up on the screen. And he also made preparations for future ministry following his release from imprisonment. If you read this in Philippians 1, 19 through 26, again, it's a lot of verses, but flip to it. Read through that passage. It's him planning ahead. Here's what I plan to do after I get out of prison. And so he is not an example of someone who flew by the skin of his teeth. Paul is actually someone who did plan ahead. The difference was when the Lord redirected him, he was ready and willing to do what the Lord had for him. He planned, but he planned with an open hand. That's the big picture here. So we think about planning from a biblical perspective. Even long-term 5-year, 10-year plan is nothing wrong with it. It's actually an example of diligence. It's actually the opposite of us being lazy and just sort of being reactive to, I don't know, I don't want to take the time to actually plan, or, I don't want to commit to anything. I'll just see what happens. And we have good examples in Scripture of long-term planning from faithful saints. So that's my argument. Hopefully you buy it. Because now I want to move into kind of the more practical side of things, and that is my 5-year plan. And this is just kind of, I'm going to detail exactly how I created my own 5-year plan, why it was so beneficial to me, and just the 3 elements of it, which are really just a vision for 5 years from now, the domains of stewardship, how it would address each area of life, and then the annual update when I actually review it. And that's the thing that I actually just did 3 days ago when I'm recording this, because I do it every year on the date when I first wrote it. So let's look at these one by one. So the first thing that I think is really helpful to have in an annual plan, and that really kicked mine off, is a vision. And I don't mean this in like a mystical sense. I just mean having a clear picture in your mind of what you would hope life would look like 5 years from now. This is sort of, you're drawing broad outlines, and then as you progress through the process of creating a 5-year plan, you start to fill in the details a little bit, right? So that's the idea. And this is actually my favorite part of this process, is dreaming a little bit. What would it look like ideally? What's a lifestyle that I think would be great for my family? What would I like church like life to look like? What would I like my health look like? And of course, you're doing this under the the idea, the umbrella of I'm trying to lead a life of faithfulness. But I think it's fun to just dream a little bit. Well, all things being equal, how would I like my life to look in 5 years? And that's sort of the vision part of it. And so I'll actually read to you the vision that I wrote 4 years ago now. And it's a little weird, but I'll just read it to you, be honest. I said, by July of 2025, I want to be living on a wooded acreage with my family, be successful enough through my writing and videos to have time to hobby farm with my family and develop 10 to 25% food self-sufficiency. I want to be walking with the Lord daily, serving in a local church, and being in good enough health to do manual labor. And again, I know that's a little weird, some of the things I put on there. And I've tweaked it over the years, but that's basically the same thing that I wrote 4 years ago. And you just get some of the again, it's a big picture thing. How would I like to live? How would what are the things I'd like to be doing in the day-to-day of life, right? I just talking about walking with the Lord, the food self-sufficiency thing. There's a little bit of a prepper in me, I think, somewhere deep down. So I think that's where that came from. Serving a local church, being in good enough health to manual labor. It's just kind of like an idea, a picture of what I would like life to look like. And here's the crazy thing, and that's what really inspired me to make this episode. When I reviewed this plan at the 4-year mark, which again was just 3 days ago, I could not believe, I tell you, I was shocked at how many of these things have come to pass. And it wasn't like I was actually even in a position when I wrote this to assume that any of this stuff was possible. Because if you zoom out a little bit, or zoom back, rewind, is that the word? If you rewind a little bit, 4 years ago, I was living in Southern California. I had no hope of living on a wooded acreage unless I won the lottery, and I don't play the lottery, right? Like everything's way too expensive, but I wanted to live in the woods. It's a random thing, but it's something I always wanted because I grew up in the woods. I didn't have any hope or thought of how would I earn money through my writing and videos? Because again, back then I was not doing this full time. I didn't make any money 4 years ago from doing this. It was not a job. It was just something I did in the mornings before work as I wrote and I talked about personal productivity from a Christian worldview. Even a farm, I didn't have enough room to hobby farm, to make food, to grow food for our family. So many of these things were a pipe dream when I wrote them. But that's the thing that's blown me away. And that's why I'm so bullish on this idea of having a 5-year plan, is most of the stuff in my plan 4 years into it, I've actually been able to reach. And I'll talk about that. I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. I'll talk about this in the next section, but that's really the big takeaway for me. When you articulate clearly a plan, you tend to work towards it, and you tend to marshal your energies to make that happen. Vision, that's the first part of a 5-year plan. So if you wanted to sit down and write a 5-year plan today, this is what I'd say start with. Write a few sentences, just dream a little bit. This would be an awesome thing to do with your spouse too. Just think, what would we like life to look like? What would a faithful life look like 5 years from now? Start with that and then move to the next part, which is more details. And this deals with your domains of stewardship. Now, I talk about this concept a lot called domains of stewardship. It's just basically breaking your life down into its various areas. When I wrote my original plan, I had not developed the domains of stewardship framework that is in my book, Redeeming Productivity, or that we teach in the Redeeming Productivity Academy. But I just wrote down these areas: family, finances, health, writing, teaching, personal development. These were just 6 areas of life that I was like, let's set a few little goals here for the next 5 years. What would I like each of these areas to look like? If I was starting this plan afresh right now, and I will be writing it a year from now, I'll probably be using the domains of stewardship that we talked about in a recent video and podcast. If you go back and look at a strategic plan for faithfulness, that's called a strategic plan for faithfulness from June 11th, 2024, just a few episodes back, you'll see I talk about this archway analogy, and we talk about your spiritual domain, your physical, your mental, your relational, your recreational, economical, vocational. That's what I would use if I was doing it again. So if you're like, you talk about domain of stewardship and you've been following me for a while and you see I have these strange categories in my 5-year plan, that's simply because it was an older one. Point being, if you're going to develop one of these, just break out some categories. Use those 7 I just listed there, or make your own. What are these different areas of your life that you want to see growth in, that you really want to make sort of a plan for the next 5 years for? Then I took each of them and wrote out some goals. So again, if you're watching on YouTube or on Spotify, I'm putting this up on the screen for you so you can see, but this is the actual plan. I wrote it in a strange note-taking app I use called Logseek. That's why it looks a little bit, the formatting's a little bit weird. But here's just the section for my family. I said spending frequent time with the family each week, doing hobbies together. Kids are homeschooling. Kids enjoy their childhood, frequent positive experiences. My wife feels supported and taken care of. She's growing in her spiritual life. We have a plan and means to care for our parents. Right, just a few of those. You can read it if you are watching. But that was kind of just like, again, broad outlines, but a little bit more specific. So that's what I encourage you to do. That's sort of the next step. If you're looking at you're drawing out a vision for the next 5 years, so then break it down. What are a few goals or things you'd like to see happen in each of these big areas of life? I'll give you another example as well. This is personal development. This was a category I wrote some goals for as well. I said I want to be reading around 50 books a year, and that is currently actually happening. I don't want to be phoning it in on anything in life. I'm doing all the things I do with integrity, with full vigor. What else might be worth mentioning? I'm well-rounded in my knowledge of a variety of subjects, including theology, philosophy, history. So that's influenced the reading that I've chosen to do as I've looked at this and chosen the books I'm going to read for the year. I reference this and intentionally try to make sure that I am picking things that help me well-rounded in that. I'm making time for hobbies, woodworking, gardening, art, whatever. Again, these are just examples. Go through each of these areas and write out, I would say, around 5, like 3 to 8 would be a good number of specific goals you'd like to have for each of these areas in the next 5 years. And obviously, you're not going to work on all these at once. And I'm not even super deliberate about when I do my quarterly or my annual plans about going in and saying, no, I'm going to work on this one. But it just, as I continue to look at this each year and each quarter, it's sort of by osmosis or by reminder, it's helping me to direct my life towards, oh yeah, that's the goal, that's the aim. I have a really clear picture of this is what we're trying to work towards. The third element of the 5-year planning methodology that I've been using is yearly updates. We have the vision, we have goals for each of domains of stewardship, and then the yearly update. And this is the thing that I just did. So every year I review that entire document and I write sort of a progress report for each of the bullets that I wrote down, each of the goals in each domain. So for example, for my writing domain, I had the goal of writing 5 books by 2025. And I wrote, let's see, at my 3-year checkup, this is a thing from last year, at my 3-year checkup, I wrote, I'm not sure how this happened, but I actually already have 3 books. And so like I was in the process of writing my 3rd book at that point. And it was funny because it's just like, it almost felt incidental. I'm like, how did this happen? It just sort of has worked out. And then I did, even in that one, I said, I'm not going to hold myself to this goal anymore. So at that point, I did abandon one of the goals because I just thought it's arbitrary. I didn't have anything I was excited about writing, but I may still hit it. There's still time. So we'll see. And so the overall vision hasn't really changed that much, even year to year. I do allow myself to adapt my goals, obviously make tweaks and all of that. But the big picture, it's really stayed mostly the same. And I do think there's some wisdom in that, being willing to adjust. You don't want to stick with a goal that's no longer relevant or important to you just because you committed to it 5 years ago, right? But I got to say, having the plan has helped tremendously. And this is sort of like my sales pitch to you on why you should really go and do this. So how has this plan helped me? It has helped me in numerous ways, and I didn't expect it to. When I first did it, I just kind of thought, I was just kind of dreaming one morning. I was on vacation. My mind was sort of wandering. I was like, what would my ideal life look like? And it's fun to dream. But I'll tell you again and again, I've come back to it for several key things. Big decisions in life. Instead of just thinking, for example, job changes. And when I was considering what to do for jobs at different points, I kept coming back to this plan and thinking, oh no, it's not just about how much I'm getting paid or about whether I like the job. Is this moving me closer to that long-term plan that I'd like to see our lives look like, right? Or is it moving me further away from it? Without a clear picture, not just in my head, but on paper somewhere, it's hard to make those big decisions. And so I think in hindsight, I don't think I would have left Grace to You. I don't think I would have moved back here to Michigan to be close to family. I don't think I would have started doing Redeeming Productivity full time. I don't think I would have done any of those things if I hadn't been noodling on this 5-year plan for so long. Because that's where I was. When I wrote this, I was living in Southern California. I was working for my dream job. It was wonderful. I loved working for Grace to You. And to me, when I wrote that plan, I'm like, none of this makes any sense. Like, how am I going to be able to take care of our aging parents? How am I going to do all this? And to me, I wasn't even like consciously like making the connection between, at that point when I wrote it, between, hey, here's where you are right now, and the direction you're headed in is not going to get you where you say you want to be. But writing it down, I think, slowly started to change my mind on that. Another big thing that's really helped me with is when you have a clear vision for a long-term future, it allows you to take risks to try and reach that future. What I mean is, risk is hard, right? Obviously, it's scary to take a risk. But especially, I'll just use the example of quitting to start Redeeming Productivity full-time. That was a multi-year risk. I was leaving in my prime earning years of life, leaving a career track and saying, let me for several years commit myself to this thing because I believe this is what God's called me to do. And I believe that this is the best way to be faithful in all these different areas that we've sort of envisioned for the long-term future of my family. And so I took a big risk, a multi-year risk, because I had a plan that was longer than those multiple years. Do you get what I'm saying? It's hard to take a big risk like that unless you can picture the payoff of it and say, hey, I think this is going to be worth it because I've clearly articulated where I think this is going to help me to get to. And so that's really the thing. It has been invaluable having a 5-year plan for my life. Over and over again, I've come back to it and been surprised at how it's helped me to stay focused, helped me to choose to do the right things, helped me to be faithful in areas when it'd be more expedient in the short term to do something else. But I'm curious what you guys think. Do you have a long-term plan? I know we've talked on here about annual plans. I know we've talked about quarterly planning, but do you have a 5-year plan? Is this something you'd be interested in doing? If so, let me know in the comments on YouTube or on Spotify if you're on there. I'd be curious to know your thoughts on this idea of long-term plan. Do you think it would be useful for you? But I would encourage you to do it. Honestly, that's sort of my final word to you. Try it. It's fun enough just to dream. Even if you don't stick with it, sit down, take an afternoon, write out a plan. So make that big vision, just a few sentences, write out some goals for some various domains of stewardship in your life, and then set a date on your calendar and say, I'm going to look at this thing that I wrote down a year from now. And you maybe completely forget about it, but I bet you'll be surprised a year when that calendar reminder comes up and you look back at that plan, you'll be like, wow, I actually have gotten closer to those things. I hope this has been helpful to you. Would love to hear your feedback. You can always write to me at Reagan@Redeeming Productivity. Love to hear questions or anything you might have. And I sometimes answer those on the podcast. If you would like to support the show, you can find us on patreon.com, become a supporter there. Or if you want to go deeper with your personal productivity, you can join our membership program, Redeeming Productivity Academy. You can find links to all that in the description and show notes. And I will see you here again next week.